All right, can we call the meeting to order? Good morning. Wow. Welcome to the first official Finance Committee of this council term. Just a few bits of logistics. I think the microphones have been turned to just demand only. It seems like we can all control our own mics. So as far as I know, only 3 can be on at once. Is that correct?
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Andres. So my, yes, Catherine? Okay. But I was going to suggest that please only turn yours on if you want to speak, and if you don't want to speak, turn them off, because they pick up every little sound, sipping coffee and turning paper. And
So if they are, we can sit anywhere.
I guess we can sit anywhere.
It does, the name takes no management. It's their demand.
It's just for putting them back, so they have to know, they have to know which mic is which.
Okay, so we're going to start this morning with an overview of the utility rate model and offsite levy model, and utilities and solid waste services operating and capital budgets. So I'm going to hand it over to Andreas Como for his presentation. Sorry. I'm new at this. So before we get to Andreas's presentation, we need to approve the agenda as presented. Is there any amendments to the agenda? Seeing none. Those in favor? Carried. Then I'll look to approval of the minutes from the August 22nd Finance Committee meeting earlier this year. Are there any errors or omissions in those minutes? Councillor McCallum?
So the meeting we had last week isn't one that was an actual Finance Committee meeting?
No, that was just an orientation meeting. It wasn't,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Any other errors or omissions? Okay, seeing none, I'll move to accept the minutes as presented. All in favor? Carried. And then now moving to presentations. Andreas.
Good morning. And just to clarify, this morning I'm just planning to talk about the utility rate model and the offsite levy model. And with that, I'm going to jump into the first one, the utility rate model. And if I can maybe just clarify the process for today, as I go through the presentation, if there are any questions, it might be easier to just talk about it at that point and then move on to the next slide, if that works for council. Okay, so with that utility rate model, we utilize 2 of them within the town of Canmore. We have one for the water side and we have one for the solid waste services side. I'm going to talk mostly about the water side and briefly about the solid waste services side. So each year we have this utility rate model, which is, we'll do a demonstration so you can see what it looks like. And as we approach each budget cycle, we go through the model and we have to do a number of updates to it. And what it ultimately does is tell us what the rates need to be in order for us to move ahead with the capital projects that we've put into place, any operational changes we put into place, inflation, any contractual obligations we have, etc. And then it spits out a rate, and that's what we propose to council each year. This is a summary of the updates that we do, the steps that we go through when we do the utility rate model. I thought this would be a good way for us to understand the model better by just going through what an update looks like. So to begin with, we look at the operating expenses. So within that, we have our contracted services. So the bulk of that is our EPCOR contract. They are the bulk of the utility. We also have a rehabilitation fund. So the EPCOR contract has a basic cost of work, and that is to operate the utility within good industry practice. Beyond that, they do a number of other work for us as well. So that is partially funded from the rehabilitation fund. That's about $800,000, and that is for anything that's a small project that isn't really a capital project. It's an existing asset that needs to be repaired. is funded out of that. EPCOR each year presents to us a 5-year rehab budget, and then we fund it, and then they come back and report to us where they did the work. Most of it is corrective, most of it's preventative, but there's a number of corrective as well as emergency work that we have to do on there. So we have a water main break. We don't plan for that. It's not something they should be obligated to pay for, so it comes out of the rehab fund. Biosolids costs, that's the final process in dealing with the wastewater, and that's pulled out, and that's a separate cost because that's done to another contract. The power and gas, the town of Canmore pays for directly, so this is where we have conversations with our facilities department. What is our cost going to be? What's our rates going to be? And then we can do our projections. We also have about $400,000 to $500,000 in internal support. So part of the utility budget pays for my salary, pays for staff members in finance who help the utility. Engineering, they are also supported with funds from the utility budget. So we're trying to make it as, so it's no impact on the taxes. So it's fully self-supporting is the ultimate goal. Then we have a number of out-of-scope pieces in there as well. So new meters, this is new developments. We pay for those out of there. The EPP is our Environmental Performance Plan that came out a few years ago from the federal government. And, the provincial government. Because the Bow River is a very sensitive river. It has a lot of users downstream, and we need to make sure that we are minimizing our impact on there. So that's just for enhanced testing and reporting and analysis that we do and submit to the province each year. Then we have the low-pressure sewer system. So down in South Canmore in the far southeast corner, there's about 200 homes in town that are on the low pressure. Sometimes they fail, and so that gives us some monies to deal with that. It's not a lot of money. Usually we spend about $15,000 or $20,000 a year on that. And then finally, leak detection and repairs. So we have a lot of pipes, about 100 kilometers of pipe. They do fail from time to time. We can't tell because our soils are very granular, so we have to go in with headsets and hook up to water valves to see where there's leaks. So that pays for that, and that's about $60,000. So we put all of that together, we put it in the model. And then the next step is we look at a capital plan. That's Alaric. The capital plan, so we use a lot of background information and reports and studies to determine what the capital plan is ultimately going to be. We have a utility master plan that we update every 5 to 6 years. We just had one approved in 2016. In 2012, we did a capacity evaluation study of the wastewater treatment plant. EPCOR comes to us with operational concerns too that weren't identified in a previous study that are issues and significant enough that will require capital upgrades, so they'll propose projects as well. Engineering does road surface work. Typically each year under those roads we have water and sewer pipes, and so at that time we also will piggyback and at the same time and before they move ahead with a project we'll do a condition assessment, some leak detection work, and determine if the deep utilities need replacing or not. And then we look at the funding source. This is where finance is fairly critical. Are we going to take debt for this? Do we have enough in the reserves? Is it appropriate? And then the funding terms, so whatever the percentage is, or if it's 10 years, 15 years, depending on the size. And it's always nice to have an extra set of eyes to take a look at the model. And then is it offsite eligible? And we'll talk a bit more about that. So we make that determination, what percentage of the project. Sometimes it's 100%, sometimes it's only 50% of the project. And we earmark that as well because that affects the funding source. And then the next one is we look at growth assumptions. So this is in development fees. We make a call down to planning and development to find out what do they anticipate in the horizon. Is it going to be the number of units that are going to come in online? And because we do identify a specific revenue source for that, and sometimes we hit it, sometimes we exceed it. And then the next one is the American Water Works Association. So in 2014, we hired a consultant to take a look at our utility rates and determine are they appropriate or not. They made a number of recommendations. One of the key ones was to move to a fixed rate that met the spirit of the Alberta Waterworks Association. So right here on the left-hand side, we have our meter sizes. So a residential is about a 15 millimeter, and then these would be your commercial. And the size is really dependent on how big it is. So if you got a very big building, like if you have a laundry service, you're going to have one of these larger meters because you need more water and you need it lots of pressure. And this is what they said. What they're saying is when you move up, the cost to maintain or to provide the services for these larger meters is much more expensive, and they have an impact. So for example, if we were 100% residential, we wouldn't need as much water pressure or water storage or ability to deal with fire as we would with some of these larger buildings. And so there's more costs associated with these larger commercial units. And what they're suggesting is when you get into the larger units, if you have a base, so that's one, for every, as you go up, this should be, so if you have, let's say, $1 for the fixed rate, then it should be $1.50 for the 20 millimeter, because it's that much more expensive to maintain and provide services to those utilities, those customers. So as you get into a 75 millimeter, it should be 15 times the rate of a 15 millimeter. So when the time we were looking to do the rate review, you can see what our actual ratio was. And we were falling quite short. We were pretty close at the smaller customers, and the middle customers were pretty bang on. However, as we got to the larger customers, we were off by at least half. And what that means is that the residential customers were subsidizing the commercial customers. Yes, Lisa?
Yeah, and I just thought it would be helpful to clarify, Andreas, that this is applying to the fixed rate only, and the fixed rate, so your water rate is made up of two portions: a fixed portion, that's a flat fee monthly, and then the variable portion based on the consumption that's used in the building. So you're not talking that...
No, the variable rate is the same for everybody.
It's the same for everybody. So this applies to the fixed rate only.
Yeah. So this is, if you don't use any water, you still have to pay this. Yes?
In some buildings, there's commercial and residential. Do those buildings, some of those buildings have two types of meters, or is there only one metering system in a commercial building?
This doesn't matter so much because that building is a large building, has a lot of customers and a lot of demand. So if they have a large meter, they're going to be paying, well, they should be paying 15 times what another one. It gets a bit tricky depending on how many units they have, but it's trying to be as fair as possible based on the impact that building has on the infrastructure.
Okay.
Some cases it's plumbed that every individual unit has their own meter. So in that case, the residential would be paying, you know, the one times, and some of the commercial units down below would be paying, you know, probably 5 times. And that's what would happen is you wouldn't have to have one big meter. You'd have probably a big pipe coming in, but then it breaks off, and the smaller one, this commercial wouldn't have a 75. They would have maybe a 38, for example.
And pay consequently less.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
So 2014, this was the split, and the council of the day had agreed to transition over 4 years to meet the fixed ratio targets set by the AWWA. So you can see here in 2017, this is what it is. And then you can see this, so it's gone from a 7, and then now it's a 12. In 2018, the rates were approved, assuming that it would be a ratio of 18 compared to a residential account, and then it'll ultimately end up at 15 as per the AWWA. Most municipalities in Alberta are using this, so we wanted to make sure that we were consistent and it was appropriate. And you can see that by 2019, we will hit that, and then those rates will stay the same. Okay. Then after we put all of those in there, the capital plan determines what our debenture costs are going to be, breaks it out by interest and principal, and then we take a look at, know what all of our expenses are, and then we also have a surplus that we need to generate each year to put in our utility reserve, so that we have a balance of $6.5 million. This was approved by council as a target for the utility reserve at $6.5 million, and then we use that as a gauge to determine for 2017 and 2018 that we had proposed a 5.5% increase in revenue to meet all the operational concerns and our debt concerns as well, and ensuring that we had enough going into the utility reserve in the long term. And I have a graph that'll show you what that looks like. And then when you put that all in, there's this little function called ta-da, and it spits out the rates, both for the residential and for the commercial sectors. And so the impact for 2017 and 2018, you can see down here, the residential accounts went up 3.2% each year. So the overall impact on each customer, if they used average consumption, was about $16.50, and almost $17 would be their impact in 2018. Now, as I said, the residential was subsidizing the commercial, so the commercials hit harder, and depending on where they're at, they're a range between 3% in 2017 to 10.5%, depending on the meter size, and in 18, it's 3 to almost 10% is the impact. Again, it's based on average use. Some use a lot, and some use less. And so the 2017 and 2018 rates, because it was a 2-year budget, have already been approved and are expected to go in place in January 1st, 2018. So when we graph that, this is the reserve balance versus the reserve target. So this red line here is our target. That's the $6.5 million right there, and we're hopeful that it will continue to grow as the cost of money grows as well. And on the blue side is what our reserve balance is. So you can see right now in 2017 we are below our reserve balance, and by 2019 we will hit our reserve balance, and then by year 5 we are above it. This model has looked like this for a long time. This is generally what it looks like. It's a little easier to predict the next 3 years versus the next 20. And so we often have the surplus that's, $35 million way out in the end. We never have hit that. I suspect the council of the day, somewhere here in 2033, will say, maybe we can go easy on the rates and we don't need a target or a surplus so high. So what I think is really important is looking at the next 10 years, and that's what this hash line is showing. So you can see that we're above, and like I said, we've always been above. And it's been very helpful to us because there's a lot of unknowns. We do put an unknown category in there, unplanned projects, but with the cost of inflation, concrete, labor, it's very difficult to really nail down the costs for each of the projects, and it gives us that buffer that if they do come in high, and it has happened from time to time where we've had to come back to council and request additional funds because we missed the mark on what the capital cost would actually be once we've gone out to tender. And that allows us to be able to do that, so that when we can come in mid-year, for example, we don't necessarily have to ask for a rate increase. The utility can absorb that rate increase. And as I said, sorry. Mayor Borman?
Thanks. So I'm trying to think back, and I don't remember ever, remind me if we've been in a situation where the balance was actually significantly or at all above target in recent years?
I believe it's looked like this, where we've been below, and in 2016 council approved the targets to go up again. They were 5 before that, and I said we usually we only project that we're going to be above it by year 4 or 5.
But when we use a chart like this, it's pretty misleading.
Yeah.
It suggests that council is okay with a target or a balance 30 million above target. So it doesn't reflect, this doesn't show reality because we've never been above target.
Correct.
I don't know if there's a way of factoring that into into a chart, but
Well, the two things that influence this, or three, is the growth assumptions. So we assume that, you know, we're going to have 3% growth, and we just project that out. So what we could do is do 1%, and what that'll do is it bring the revenues down significantly, so you're not going to have that. The other is you can influence by the capital. That's one of the biggest expenses, is you can bring that down, or the operational expenses and the inflation rate we apply to that.
I suppose one thing that would be helpful from the perspective I'm expressing is to have the chart reflect some, I don't know, 10 years of history showing that it really is always below target.
Mm-hmm. That's a good idea. Where we've actually been.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm confident we haven't hit 35 million in surplus. Yeah. Or not surplus, but reserve balance. Yes, Councilor Sanford?
So theoretically, in the past, we've been using debt financing for some of the infrastructure at on the utility side. Is that
We use a
correct?
combination of debt or reserve funding.
Right.
Yes.
So we have been using debt in the past. Now, theoretically, if we exceed our target, would that mean that we would have to use less debt financing because the money would be in the reserve that could be used? Or are we still considering that combination for?
I think we'll always use that combination, like a large project where, you know, it's $5-6 million, that can deplete the reserve overnight. What I can tell you is we have a number of smaller projects that are less than $1 million, 300,000, 400,000, 800,000, 75,000. A lot of those are because they're replacing existing assets. We're trying to transition over the last couple of years to fund most of those from reserves. So we're taking less debt. We only do it if it's new infrastructure or significant.
Okay. So ultimately, this reserve escalation that we see is often just brought down by whatever project we're doing at the time, right? So it's theoretical in the sense that we don't do anything project-wise for the next 25 years, but that's not very realistic.
Agree.
Right, okay.
And as I said, the solid waste services utility is the same. It's just it's a little bit less complicated, and the numbers are smaller. And so here is their similar projection of the next 20 years. And this is why it's not such a bad thing to go out to 20 years, even though it's, you know, it's really far and hard to see. You can see here we're actually above reserves. But then it drops again in 2017, and then it goes back up. This is the reserve balance. This piece here is largely associated. We just purchased or just constructed a $6.2 million waste management center, and they're suggesting that at some point we're going to have to replace that equipment. And the equipment inside the sort line is about $1.5 million. And so if we go out 20 years, when you have to replace that with inflation, and it's going to be a significant hit for that. And so that's why there's benefit to see that at some point, 15, 20 years out, there's going to be a huge hit, and we need to make sure that we have the monies for that, or we're going to end up having to take debt for it. But there's an interest in trying to fund some of these existing asset replacements with reserve funds. But maybe we don't replace, this is assuming we replace the whole thing, maybe we replace only parts of it. But at least, you know, we're going to start to build up the reserves to assist with that ultimate decision or expense in the future. But similar to the water utility, this is what it's really looked like year after year after year. It's been very similar. But it's good for us to be aware of that. So then I thought it might be beneficial to show you the models themselves. And you can see here, it's a number of tabs. Yeah. Hopefully everybody can everyone see that? Do I need to make it a bit bigger? So you can see along the bottom, there's a number of tabs that we use. This is a first good one to see. This is the summary. This is where all the other sheets funnel into. And at the bottom, you can see that that's where we get a lot of our data from. And I think to Councillor Sanford's question, you can see this is what our debt balance is, how much debt we have outstanding. And you can, in the long term, the goal is to try to use less and less debt. So we break the utility out by water and wastewater. And the first thing we do is, as I said, we go to our expense line. And you can see here, this is the cost of basic work. This is what we pay EPCOR for the water portion of the contract, not the total contract. That's going to be on the next one, which is the wastewater expense. And there's the rehab expense. Again, it's broken down by water-related projects. And then we also apply an inflation rate for new growth to the system. We add in each year, and again, it's based on assumptions we make at the front of the model. So it determines what our contract costs are related to water, and then we go to the out-of-scope stuff that I talked about earlier. So new meters, there's our environmental performance plan, new hydrants, aquifer monitoring, leak detection, and so on. And then our power and gas related to the water water infrastructure.
So just to clarify again, you say out of scope, but it's not out of scope of EPCOR's contract. It's just not contained within the basic work because it can't be predicted on an annual basis, the costs. So,
yeah, and it's also because we can't, we could cancel those at any time.
Okay.
We can't cancel the cost of the contract without negotiating this, but we could stop doing leak detection. That's another, and we've always called it out of scope. Maybe that's not the best term, but it's out of the O&M contract.
But for example, the environmental performance plan is part of our
approval
to operate.
Yeah.
So at some point, would we not want to work that into the contract, that extra monitoring of the environmental parameters affecting the river?
We could. We don't know how long it's going to be required. I mean,
Okay.
At this point, the numbers are, the monitoring values that we're seeing are suggesting we don't have to do some future projects. Mm-hmm. And so it may disappear, and then we can negotiate it out too, like we've done in the past.
Okay. Thanks.
And as I said, that's on the same on the wastewater side. So there's the cost for basic work, and then infrastructure and growth, rehab, and then there's the biosolids number in there as well. And then low pressure sewer, because low pressure is wastewater, it's going to show up on this spreadsheet and not on the water side. Then the next thing we do is we go into the capital plan. And so you can see here, we break the projects out by system type. So we have wastewater treatment, water treatment, distribution system, collection system, and then life cycle miscellaneous. And so we have identified all of these projects, and this is the type. Is it offsite eligible? What's the funding source? And then there's the value and the timing, the year that it actually takes place. So that allows us to predict what's in there. So these projects will mirror what was approved by council in the 5-year capital plan. And then down here at the bottom, where it's dark blue, if I'm just going to scroll here to the side, you can see we then start to put in unplanned capital improvements. So we do already put significant dollars in there, and we just extend that out with inflation over time, and that gives us that buffer in case projects do come in higher than what we had projected. And you can see the funding source down here. And then, this is the really fun sheet that looks at determines our interest and our principal costs over the next 20 years. And you can see right now we've been assuming 3%. And again, this is, we don't know what's going to happen with interest rates with the Bank of Canada. So they've grown up to 6% in 20 years out. But they could stay low. We don't really know. Those are the things that we have no control over and will have an impact when we do take debt. So all of those then come up to the summary, and then we need to determine if our expenses are such that we're now below our reserve balance, our reserve target in year 5, then we need to start playing around with the revenue side. And this is what we largely do, is just start playing with how much revenue do we need, and that's why that slide I'd said that for 2017 and 18, and for the next couple of years, we're going to need about a 5.5% increase in revenue to be able to accommodate all the capital costs and meeting our debt limits, or sorry, not our debt limit, but our utility reserve balance. And then you can see that it starts to taper off to about 5% each year. And then, so we have, on this side, we have a number of what our consumption is. So this is in cubic meters. So you can see the residential is significant at about 820,000 cubic meters a year. And this is how many accounts we actually have. And then it does the ta-da, and these are where the rates show up. It's amazing how it can do that. And then this, all of those sheets fill into the summary. So this is what the wastewater looks like by itself, and this is what the water looks like by itself. And then we combine them here, and then you can see that's the picture that we showed you in the PowerPoint presentation. Yes, Lisa?
I'm wondering if you could show the ta-da. So
Sure.
So if you look at what this chart looks like right now,
Yeah.
right? And then if Andreas changes another rate
So
somewhere.
I'm gonna
Put 0 or
Put
1%, 2%?
All right, so now we're gonna have 900,000, $9 million in revenue is what we need now. And you can see this is the split in cost too. I'll show you this is. As long as it doesn't hit save. Yeah. Well, we have. I have a master copy. Yeah, that's for a good reason. So then you can see here all these numbers. This really here, this variance. What it does is it tells you that you are. It's a test. What you want is all these numbers to be 0. So you can see, just so before we start, you'll see that right now the residential charge for a fixed rate is $16.97. Control Z? Yeah, I was going to. Oh. Oh no. Yeah.
You don't have the macro solver installed on that computer? Oh,
no.
bummer.
Oh, that's too bad. Because that's really disappointing. It's fun.
Trust us. That's the...
It really
command
is
will
magic.
stop the debugger. Okay, yeah. My apologies. It's pretty cool. Anyway, it would change all of those so that these would all be zeroed out. You can see that right now, for example, the wastewater fixed is quite high, and so it will bring it down and raise the other ones because they're negative. And how it does that is it goes back up in here, plays around with these different revenue sources here, which then funnel back up to the individual rates based on what our projected consumption and how many account holders we have. And it'll spit out a new one. The next time we're in front of council about this, we'll make sure that we have this ready to show you. Okay. And if there are no questions on the utility rate model, I'm just going to show you quickly the Solway Services model. So very, very similar. There's the summary sheet. Similarly, it's broken out by recycling and waste collection. And here, I'm sorry, I'll open. And then you can see that's similar to what you saw before in the presentation. We just copy and paste it over. And here you can see that there's the expenses, so we go through and look at what the expenses are going to be. And then we look at the capital plan. Sorry, these are all very small. A little bit more color-coded here. We have a number of garbage trucks, and it's very difficult to keep them all straight. So that's why they're color-coded. And so when we buy a new garbage truck, we will buy it with debt. And then when we replace it, the idea is that we're going to fund it with reserve. That's the goal in managing this utility. And then, so similarly, it will have the debt, the term, what the interest rates will be, and then it's summarized up here under expenses. Not a lot of contracted service here, not as much as utilities, so a lot more of the lines for salary, wages, and benefits is much higher. And then we, like I said, it develops this graph for us. Yes?
Question may be more for Catherine, but so philosophically, you've been explaining how in this area of our work, we're trying to build reserves to avoid using future debt for capital projects. But on all of our other discussions around future capital projects, or on a lot of the other discussions, we talk about using debt financing as a better model so that those who will benefit from that capital project will be paying for it. So is there a discrepancy here in philosophy, or?
So while Catherine's coming over, I can answer that. We do have a debt policy, and that policy applies to our utility debt as well as it applies to any other debt that we take for road infrastructure or buying a fire truck, for example. So while we do want to develop reserves to replace existing assets, and there's significant amount of assets in both the water and solid waste utilities, the intent when you're purchasing new or buying or building a piece of infrastructure that has a long life, we do use debt to fund those projects.
And that will continue to be
that's our policy, and
for this regardless.
Right.
Okay.
But Catherine may want to
add. Just to sort of add to that, you know, historically we've taken debt for perhaps utility projects that may not have been served best by taking debt because there wasn't the reserves available to provide the nimbleness. So for example, Mr. Como had mentioned earlier that there were projects that are 800,000 or 250,000. In the past, debt has been taken for those types of projects, and relatively speaking, that's quite a small dollar amount, and those really should be funded from reserves, but we didn't have that availability.
So the big capital projects, the millions of dollars, would still be using some debt for financing?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the offsite levy model. So offsite meaning that we have, for example, a lot of water and wastewater infrastructure, and we have about 6,000 homes in town. And so what this does is that as a new home gets added, they haven't paid into this infrastructure. And at some point, we have to do growth. We have to expand the wastewater treatment facility or a lift station or the water treatment plant to accommodate these additional units that are coming on. So what this model essentially does is determine what their costs are to buy into the system. This is how it works. So what you see down here is we have identified a number of infrastructure that we need to put in to ultimate build out. Then we look at how many units that we are projecting by ultimate build out. And what that does is it gives us our cost per unit each year. And so as a developer comes in and they're going to take a single family home sitting on an R2 lot and they're going to put a duplex in there, they're doubling that property's impact on the water and wastewater facilities. And so what we do is when they come in, we have a rate that we need to charge them so they can buy into the system, because they're effectively doubling, they're adding one more unit to it. That's infill. As we go farther out and we have land that doesn't have any development on it, the same thing applies. If there's a bare section of land that they're going to add in a 30-unit condo complex, similarly they have to pay that unit rate times 30 in order to buy into the system. And why we try to do that is so that growth pays for growth and the impact doesn't rest on the people that are already here, that have already bought into the facilities. What we want the current ratepayers to pay for is the fixed rate and the variable rate, which is to keep the system running, not to have to pay for any future expansion to the facility to accommodate new units that are coming online. So you can see an example of some of the facilities we have. Wastewater treatment plant is a big one. There's a pipe down below. If we have to take a pipe and make it bigger to accommodate more homes using that pipe, then it would be part of the off-site levy. Roads, so arterial roads, if we need to make those bigger to accommodate more traffic, then we can put those on the off-site levy model as well. We'll go through an example of how many of those are. So essentially, when we look at the off-site levy model each year, we want to make sure it's equitable. So for those developments, so for example, we have a lift station in one part of town and we're doing an upgrade to it. We don't expect on the other side of town, if a new unit comes online, that they have to pay for part of it, because none of their sewage actually goes through that lift station. So that's why we want to make it equitable, and that'll be a bit more clear as we go through the presentation. And as I mentioned, growth pays for growth. So we're not having the existing customers pay for these new infrastructure. It's that growth, new units pay for the new equipment. And then the levies are based on total project costs. So we apply for grants when they're available. In some cases, up to a third of the cost. We're just completed a $5 million expansion of the wastewater treatment plant, and we were able to get 32% funding for that from the province. And so the cost that we assign to the offsite level model is the cost of the project minus the grant dollars. And then legislative compliance. We need to make sure that we're in compliance with how offsite levies are to be applied in the municipality per the MGA.
So aren't some of these things holistic in the sense that if you buy a new garbage truck, it's not going to be exclusive to one neighborhood, it's going to be in the system and circulating through? So how do we deal with those sorts of expenses?
The offsite levy model is mostly water and wastewater with some roads. There's no waste collection in there at all.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, yes?
But if you, I think, extend that analogy to include, say, the wastewater treatment plant, which would apply to all zones because everything flows to the wastewater treatment plant, then yes, the cost for a wastewater treatment plant upgrade would be applied to every area of town. Whereas a cost for a lift station upgrade would only be applied to the area of town where sewage would flow to that.
Their sewage goes through that lift station,
Right.
Then only those homes or a new home going in that zone would be responsible for the cost for the lift station. But yeah, like Lisa said, the wastewater treatment plant, everything goes through there, and so everybody pays for any expansion there.
Just a quick question. When we take a look at older areas and we haven't collected the offsite levy, how does that work when they do need replacements and everything else?
We don't go back. If we don't have a record of them, we assume that if the unit's there, that they've paid, or that we're not going to go back. And so if we need to do any expansion in there, then it's any additional units that, and it's a line between, if we're going to replace it with the same size just because it's old, that's not offsite eligible, right? If we're replacing it because it's cracked and it's failing, we're just simply life cycling it, and it won't show up here as a project. Now, if we're starting to see more pressure on that pipe, we've got a lot of potential for growth in there in the next 5-10 years. There's a lot of units that are earmarked for that. Then we're going to take a pipe that's this big, and we're going to replace it with a pipe this big, and that difference can go in here. So maybe 50% of the project cost is applicable, and that only will apply to the new units that are coming on, not the ones that are already there.
Thank you.
Do we have an accurate record of how much vacant serviced land we have that's not feeding into the utility rates?
I'm not sure I know what you mean.
So it's serviced, but nobody's using the service, right? Do we have a record? Do we know how much vacant service land we have?
So this is where we have a road with a pipe through it and services are to the side, but
Right.
there's no homes or there are
Right,
homes?
there's no homes.
It would be
'cause
very
it's-
minimal.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
negligible in the community?
I would say yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's just sporadic all throughout
Like
town.
if we think out in Three Sisters, you know, as they build those units, they tie them in, right? They build the road, they put the pipes in, they put the services in, then they start building, you know, they sell the lots. And so that's really the big part is, you know, the time from when the service, the deep utility work is done by the time they have built the lots. And then there's that tie-in. And so when the economy is hot, you know, those lots sell quickly and they're being built right away and they're not sitting vacant or unused.
Just to add to that, I mean, vacant land is an assessed class, so we could find that number quite quickly as far as what's the total assessment of vacant land and how many properties that represents.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so what's eligible? Like I said, Councillor Comfort asked about, you know, the waste collection. So you can see here, it's not. It's really just about the treatment, storage, transmission. So a reservoir would be eligible because we don't have it right now, and we're likely going to build it because we're going to have a capacity issue at some point for storage. Treatment, expanding the water treatment plant, for example. Same thing on the wastewater side. Pipe storm systems, again, if we need, those are eligible. And then, like I said, roads or any land required for connection with any of the above facilities that we would need would also be off-site eligible. What's not eligible is the list here. So on-site work, repairs, maintenance, again, like that's covered in the operating, pedestrian infrastructure, street enhancements, cultural centers, affordable housing are not covered in there. The blue, I believe the province is looking at those ones right now to possibly extend those to be eligible within the off-site levy. So if we need to put in a new police station or expand the library because we have community growth, the rec center or an additional fire hall, then that would become off-site eligible, but that's not the case yet. But they're looking at that. Oh, well, there you go. Yeah. My present. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's great. I was not aware of that. So back to what we were talking about with the lift station example about affected homes. So you can see here on this map of the town of Canmore, we have orange and blue. It's more of a brown, I guess. So blue is water infrastructure. Orangey brown is wastewater infrastructure. You can see the town is scattered with it all over the place. And so if we look for an example here out in Three Sisters, we've got this west location, which includes Peaks and Hospital Hill. And there is this lift station here, number 4. We just did an update to it a little while ago to increase capacity. Sorry, I'm moving my cursor. So this project here, as we increase the capacity, we add that to the offsite levy model, and then anybody within this zone, this west zone, this purple zone, any additional units would have to pay their portion of that project. And same thing with the wastewater treatment plant. That's just this big circle right here. Everything goes there. So regardless of where those additional units are projected to come in and once built, they would have to pay for that. Okay, and what we don't, and you can see those colors here, we also have some specific areas, Palliser and TP Town. So if any specific works happen there, they have a different layer that we use. And then Harvey Heights, we have a regional services agreement to provide water and wastewater services to the municipal district of Bighorn. So they're hamlets of Harvey Heights and Deadman Flats. We don't have a specific zone for them, but we do have them in the model. And so Harvey Heights is up here to the north. So as they tie in over here, anything coming down Bow Valley Trail, for example, that leads ultimately to the wastewater treatment plant or the water treatment facility, any additional units that they put in there, they would have to pay for. And same thing down to the south, where Dead Man's Flats ties in from the south into the west end. Any of the lift stations that they would need to use to get to the wastewater treatment plant, they would have to pay for as well, with each unit. So we have this capital plan, and I believe that's one of the conditions within the Municipal Government Act is we can only put in there what's in the 5-year capital plan. We do have a number of projects that are beyond the 5-year capital plan that are identified in the Utility Master Plan. The Utility Master Plan will go out 20 years, but we do have the 5-year capital projects in there. Any projects that we put beyond that, we put at a discount, which we'll talk a little bit later. And then what we do is we look at what the costs are to be recovered. The model also looks at what the cost of money over time. We make sure that it's the right benefiting zones that we identify in the model. And then the number of units are identified. So this is where we go back and forth with the developers. What are they projecting to build? And then we update the model with those, how many units are left. That's a fairly key one because that's the denominator, right? So if that number is lower than what will actually happen, as we get closer to build out, those last couple of units are going to have to pay a significant amount of money. Ideally, you'd want this number as accurate as possible, but if it's too low, it causes some grief for us. Similarly, too high for the other end. Then we throw a risk factor in there. As I said, some of our capital projects are outside the 5-year plan, and in order for us to allow them in there, we discount them by about 75% until they come into the model, into the 5-year plan. You know, technology changes, things change, and as such, you know, we're not 100% guaranteed that some of the projects are going to go forward. So allow us to put them in there, we discount them by 25%. So we only put 75% of the cost into the model. And then back, as I said, this is what we talked about at the start, the cost of all the infrastructure for growth. So we have, the model will figure out what the total cost is, again, the number of units to full build out, and then we ultimately end up with an offsite levy model. The fees for each of the zones are going to be different because of the infrastructure that they have in place and how many units are left to be built. Some of the things that we're very aware of as we do this and we have our conversations with the development industry is the infrastructure costs perceived full funding resulting in, so we have to front those costs. That's the big challenge with the offsite levy model. And they often have to happen before those units can begin. So we don't have capacity at the wastewater treatment plant. We have to build that. That's about 3 years, $5 million before we can let a unit on. So we need to make sure we always have capacity. And we have to front those costs. We pay them out front, and then we collect those costs over time. So we carry that risk. So when we have, sorry.
I could have waited till he finished that part, but
okay.
Finish and then before you change slides.
Yeah, so the big unknown, which is why that's that crystal ball that I showed earlier in the presentation, we don't know what the level of development is going to be. And so if the development goes down or slows, then our revenues slow and our ability to pay for those projects back again. But if they go up, then we have a significant amount of money coming in that we hadn't planned on. And so it's that balance we have of fronting the costs and trying to anticipate what the revenues are going to be to cover those costs because we have debt costs associated with those projects. So we carry all the risk for these projects. So we want to be sure that we're confident that they're necessary and that the developments are going to occur. So if development stops, the revenue stops. And we saw that happen in 2007 or 2009. Mayor Borman?
Sure, just for understanding, particularly the new councillors, could you explain how we arrive at the number of units to reach build-out?
So it's a combination of area structure plans. So we sit down with the big developers and we, you know, they have, let's say, 300 units that are left. So, I mean, the model already has a unit count in there, so we just check in each year. Is that unit count still accurate or not?
Yeah, but I mean the original unit count, so
Oh,
tallying what was approved in NRCB or in bylaw 198 plus what's been approved in Silvertip and the anticipated build out in TP Town and South Canmore. So there's a number that's been arrived at, which is arbitrary in a sense, but not, or do you want me to?
No, I think that's what Mr. Como was alluding to when he said we look at the area structure plan. So yeah, planning and development review all the approved plans that are in place for large greenfield development. You know, I believe there's an inferred infill development
yes,
number
we know,
as well.
Yeah, our zoning will dictate how many units of infill as well. So we have South Canmore, a lot are R4, R2 that are single-family homes, so we know we're going to get, at some point, we're going to get a number of units out of there as well.
I think one of the nuances that has been applied, and it's really that crystal balling that planning and development does, is they apply a confidence factor to the total number of units. So if there's 4,000 units remaining to be built in Three Sisters, for example, to date, we don't have a high level of confidence that those units will actually be built. So there's, you know, as was explained, because the number of units is the denominator in the overall calculation, it is significant. So if the number is too high, we're actually going to be collecting not collecting enough offsite levy revenue to cover our project.
The offsite levy fees will be too low.
Yeah, offsite levy fees would be too low. So, but that again is a negotiation or a discussion with developers, because we do need to ensure that they have understanding of it and generally support that approach.
So in that total number, all of the currently approved ASPs don't add up to the number of units that we use for build-out. That includes unassigned units for Three Sisters that were approved initially in the 90s, but haven't actually been dedicated to specific ASP.
Yes.
Right.
This number is not something that we've arrived at in the last 5 years. This is a calculated number that goes back long before I showed up in town. It's actually mentioned in the 98 NDP, about 34,000 people or whatever, and then you backtrack what that is in terms of units.
So there are two different things. So the 34,000 or the roughly 30,000 people at build-out number that's been going around, so that was an exercise that was done with the utility master plan, basically looking at a theoretical build-out. And that's unrelated to these numbers here. These numbers here are, and the calculation for these numbers are based solely on projected unit counts. Nothing to do with a theoretical future build-out of how many people may.
But the theoretical future build-out would have been based on your utility master plan, but also based on ASPs, NRCB, bylaw 198, all that stuff.
Sure.
Nearly 20 years ago.
Sure, yes.
Okay, all right. I think it's just for some members of the public, it's a surprise that this is the possible build-out number, whereas this has not been a surprise. It's been something that's been known for 20 years, and we've been building all of our plans around that, either tightly, depending on how soon that development's going to happen, or loosely, based on your confidence number that you speak of.
Yeah, the UNP would have used those numbers for the last 10 years.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So, talking about TP Town and the explosion that we had in town, those places, when they went to redevelop their properties, they never paid into the levy right away. So we're chasing that and we're collecting.
No.
When did the levies start? Was that 98, or were we always collecting off-site levies?
I'm not sure when we began, Lisa.
Yeah, the levies around 98. So any property developed pre-98 did not pay off-site levies. However, infrastructure was built, and so, you know, typically those were funded by taxes and other forms. We didn't have a separate off-site levy model until 1998, maybe even 2000. It was around the time that we signed the contract with EPCOR that we did the utility rate model for the very first time. I think we explained this in one of the orientation sessions. The Municipal Government Act sets out that off-site levies can only be collected once in respect of land, right? So it doesn't matter what building's on there. You know, if you have a fire or an explosion or something, if off-site levies were collected once before, you cannot collect again. And so, but because in some of the older neighborhoods, there were no off-site levies collected at all, as the areas are rezoned and we get increased density built there, we are charging off-site levies for that increase in density. So if a single-family home goes to a duplex or a fourplex, we collect for the additional units.
Okay, thanks.
So, I'm sorry, it's not a rabbit hole question, but it may start off with. So is that based on the philosophy then, and I've had this one in my head, sorry, for a while. Is that based then on the philosophy that prior to the off-site levy model being instituted in the town of Canmore, that taxpayers were basically supporting the utility model through their taxes? Yeah. And that was a major shift in how the town operated with the introduction of the off-site. So then we weren't, the town at the time, or the community at the time then would not have been making, they would have been making utility decisions based on politics versus based on an actual utility model constructed need. We need a new pump here. This is not a political decision. This is we need a new pump here sort of thing. So when you separate the model out, as we have now, then decisions are being made on what's actually best for the utility, not necessarily what's a political decision. Yeah. Well, that's what I'm a politician.
Yeah. I think, you know, I would answer that question in just saying, once Canmore started to experience sort of high levels of growth, once we implemented water metering and established a utility, we had water meters for a number of years before we actually started charging. You know, there was a big shift in public acceptance from going to having your water and sewer covered through your taxes to having it covered by your actual consumption and your, you know, paying based on consumption, et cetera. So there was yes, a complete change in philosophy and approach to managing and funding utility infrastructure based on user fees.
User pay model. And
user pay, growth pays for growth, and users pay for what they consume. That was all in the late 90s. Water meters started to be installed around mid-90s, and so, yeah, that whole philosophical change.
And just as an aside, there was some sort of off-site levy scheme prior to 1998, because I know that my neighbors were paying into something that they still complain about 30 years down the road. Peter Perrin. But it wasn't, I don't think it was applicable at the time. I think it was more like a fishing expedition.
Could I just clarify a couple of points? So Ms. DeSoto is correct in everything that she said, obviously. But I just want to note there's two pieces. So I think your question, Councillor McCallum, was around, my understanding is that we've been charging off-site levies since, I think the
model's created in 2000.
There was 130,000 in 2000, that's all.
I think there were off-site levies from the late 70s
Thank you.
being charged at a very low rate. But I've seen references, and if necessary, we could dig those. But there was a bylaw because we have to assess those by bylaw.
So newer home builders on my street that built before 98, I think.
They may have, and it's tricky research for the planning department to check back in some of those situations that are in the gray area. So as Ms. DeSoto said, where there is intensification and offsite levies have not been paid, we are charging for the additional units. That is a relatively recent change. So that was in 2016 we clarified that. The practice of the planning department and council previously was if my house had not paid offsite levies and was being redeveloped, we would charge offsite levies for that single unit, even if a single existing home were demolished and a new home being built. So that was, I believe it was a 2016 change. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Perfect. There was no scurrying, there was waltzing.
I was in other meetings, so I missed if there are other questions, but I trust Ms. DeSoto and Mr. Como are 100% accurate in what they presented.
Okay.
Scurry off.
I don't trust you back there. So we have this model. We've had it since 2000. Each year we do, or at least we've committed to now, to begin ensuring that we do an annual review of that. There were periods where we weren't doing it, and it's prudent to do it because capital costs change, and we need to make sure that the unit counts are looked at and discussed, and the capital funding or the capital project numbers are also updated as well, so that we ensure that we have the right top number to apply to the denominator. So we sit down between the planning and development team, engineering, finance, and public works, reviews the model, and we look at, again, like I said, how many units are left, what are the benefiting zones, making sure that they're accurate, we don't have to redo lines in the zones, what are the new projects, updates on costs, and then it spits out what the offsite levy fee is based on the unit type in the different zones. Then once we have that model, we sit down with BODA, who represents the development industry, as well as the MD of Bighorn, because they are impacted by this with their two hamlets, Harvey Heights and Deadman's Flats, to ensure that they understand how the model continues to work, what the changes we've made to it, checking in that the unit counts are still accurate, what they predict it's going to be, when the timing of those developments, and the rationale behind the rates so that they're aware. And then after that, once they are completely understanding, then we bring it to council early in the year to have the new rates approved through approval of an offsite levy bylaw amendment.
If there are those changes to the MGA that address fire halls, rec centers, etc., would those then be included in those discussions, or are we just still talking about only wastewater?
Well, it sounds like a fairly new decision, so we'll need to determine how. We don't have capital projects right now for any of those, so once we do identify a project, we can now put them in the model and then have those conversations with the development industry.
The fire hall is actually in the 5-year capital plan. 5 years out, we have the money for design and investigation, and construction is 6 years out. So it's something we need to address. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I have an additional question that's more operational. So with the offsite levy and these changes that have come through the MGA, we obviously cannot collect for development that's already occurred. It's just future development. But it's actually at the point of development, correct? So just because we approve a new ASP and we haven't gotten our offsite levy new model with including those new pieces of infrastructure, doesn't mean that it doesn't apply. It actually applies at development permit, correct?
That's right, yes.
All right, thank you.
And just on the first bullet point, I would point out that the consultation with BODA is a requirement of the MGA. Yes, it is something we are required to do.
Okay. And This is messy, but what I wanted to just really highlight here, unless there are any specific questions, is the life of a project. So when we identify a project, it's based on a value that's been estimated by a consultant. So that goes on to the offsite levy model. It's not based on actual costs. We put it in there. It's in the 5-year plan. We advise the development industry. And then we begin the project, which happens here. The project is commissioned. We're really close on what we feel that the cost of the project is going to be. Then the project's completed. And like I said earlier, the town of Canmore is the one that fronts all of those costs. But we don't really see it as the project has been completely funded yet, because we need to recoup those costs. So a lot of projects sit over here that they're complete, but they're partially funded because we haven't received the revenue from the offsite levy units that are still projected to come. Once they are, then they're fully funded. And this is where we see ourselves, once we hit full build out and all the last unit has been completed. But projects can sit on our books or inside the offsite levy model for a significant amount of time until that last unit is collected, especially if we look at a project like the wastewater treatment plant. The last unit is going to pay for any of the work that we've done in there. And so it will sit on the books for a while, and in the interim, the town of Canmore is assuming that risk, that it'll get paid.
Just off the top of your head, can you tell me what the total value is of the future projects that are involved or are included in the offsite levy model?
I don't have it on the top of my head, but I have the model here. We can take a look at what that total sum is, what's to be collected. Still, is that what you're looking for?
Yeah,
the balance?
Just curious.
Yeah. Okay. And so what I think is important for council to be aware of is that, when the growth is high, we have lots of revenue. I mean, things are great. When it's low, it's not so good, because then it's difficult for us to meet our debt costs. Because when we do an offsite levy project, we will fund it from debt. It has integrity. The intent is, that's why we look at it each year, is that we are confident that over time, full build out, that we're going to collect all of those monies. So it'll be really interesting to see what it looks like 20, 30 years, however long that is, we don't know. And what it also assumes is that we're going to get full build out. So those are some of the unknowns. And there are cash flow issues. So at times the ratepayer does have to pay, and there are times where the development pays more than the ratepayer. And this is a good example. You can see going back to when the offsite levy model began, you can see this is the revenues that we were collecting. And then it really spiked in 2003, 2004. It dropped again and then spiked again in 2007. And then we had the economy crash in the province of Alberta, so it really dropped significantly. And then it's kind of been stable the last couple of years, and we can see right here that it's starting to grow again. On the left side is our debt servicing costs. So this is what we're committed to paying each year. These are debt servicing costs that are specific to projects in the offsite levy model. So what we want to have is the blue above the red, because then we have adequate amount of money to pay for the debt. When we dip below the debt, then we don't have enough money, and we end up in a difficult situation. And one of the things that surfaced in 2010, because if I just draw a little line here, you can see that everything was looking good, and things were crashing over here on our revenue side, and yet we were putting in more infrastructure and increasing our debt. And so then we had a problem with the utility in that we weren't getting enough money, and effectively the development industry was subsidizing the utilities operations. And so we had to do a switch where Council of the Day had committed to $1 million to help fund this from taxes until we were able to get the books back in order, so that we were having the development industry pay for their debt. And I think that took about 3 years by increasing the rates on the utility rate customers, so that we could accomplish the costs for the funding for the debt here. So we're going to, I find interesting is we're going to be in that situation again, especially if these continue. Again, this is something we just don't know, but at least now we do track the debts for offsite and for non-offsite separately, so that we don't end up in a situation where we have the development industry or the ratepayer subsidizing the other party.
Isn't the axis on the horizontal axis incorrect in its legend? Yeah. So we're not talking about millions there on the left. We're talking about thousands. Yeah.
Sorry?
Well, the legend would have it that that's $1,000 million, that middle line.
Oh, billion, yeah, okay, sorry, yeah, right. Yeah.
It would be an expensive town to operate in at $1 billion in infrastructure.
Okay, if no further questions there, then, as I said, we have the model here. Mayor Borman, we can determine what the so similar to the other models, there's a number of tabs. If we go to, yeah, so here's a list of all the projects going back to 1986 that were completed in 99 plus. And so you can see there's a lot of projects, about 65 projects, and the total, Rick, you're saying it's $55 million is left to be recovered based on the projects that we've identified.
Right now we're collecting on the basis of $55 million.
That's right, as it stands right now. And
Yeah, so that's what's left outstanding, right? We've fronted those costs, right. Some of that debt has been retired, and we still haven't covered the costs for those projects. And some of the projects haven't happened, yes.
If another $20 million project came along, that would just be added into that. So it'd be, right now we're collecting on, we're trying to pay down $55 million worth of debt.
Right. So,
anticipated debt.
yeah.
Anticipated, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So back to sort of the question that Councillor McCallum was asking, or that you were asking about how the number of units that will essentially recover those costs from, you know, if, for example, the economy or there were decisions made not to develop certain areas of town, and so 2,000 units dropped off our model. Offsite levy costs, you know, there would be difficult decisions. Either you're going to be charging the rest of the units in town exorbitant offsite levy rates, or we would have to agree to fund this in some other method, through taxes, etc.
In your presentation, maybe I missed it, but did you show what the actual offsite levies are currently per unit in the different areas?
Yeah. So you can see what they are right here. So a new unit coming out in Three Sisters, for example, the west, a dwelling unit is $77,156.
Right. So
yeah, per door. And this is what they were in 2016. So you can see the increase. Yeah, percent change, about $90.
Which adds up. I mean, so we've heard from small developers, for instance, who are building fourplexes in TP Town, and they imagine wanting to build housing that would be affordable when they're perturbed that they're paying whatever it adds up to in TP Town. Yeah.
TP Town is a special case because there's both TP Town and then there's the overlay district. So, yeah, 14,000.
So
yes.
15,000 per unit if a fourplex, it adds up.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, just want to make that point. That's what they're first world. Yeah. And just while I have the mic, thinking back to my earlier question, So the number of units to build out, does that include like all of Silvertip's approved units, the 1,300 commercial units, and I think that's my point.
Yes. That's the short answer. I mean, the more elaborate piece is that there are some, we are somewhat cautious, so we have to assume that there's going to be a full build-out, but there's also, especially in some areas like Teepee Town, where there are individual owners, and it's a lower likelihood of, in the next 20 or 40 years, that every single available lot will. It's a different circumstance. You know, probably the opposite end of the spectrum is Spring Creek Mountain Village, where we have a single developer who is very methodically going through and basically doing exactly what he said he was going to do in the area redevelopment plan. So there's a relatively high degree of certainty that in the next 20 to 40 years, we will see all of those units. So there is some discounting built into the future unit projections where we're less certain that we're going to see all of those units actually come to fruition, because as was discussed earlier, the risk is that there are expensive infrastructure projects and the last 100 units are going to be charged for all of those projects. I mean, the offsite levies would be $1 million a door, never mind.
But to be clear, we are now in a process of doing an annual review of this. So every year, and that was not historically the case, but we have started that in the last, I think, year or two now, where each year we meet with the developers. So for example, Mr. Turcotte, Silvertip, they're looking at maybe updating their ASP and moving forward with the development. If that should materialize and there are some material changes, we would capture that in the annual review, and then we'd be able to incorporate it immediately. Similarly, with the projects that go into the model, every year, you know, we just did the UMP, Utility Master Plan, that was just completed last year. We use that to update projects that may be included in the model. And then we're able, because we're doing that on an annual basis, we're doing fine adjustments as we go along. And so even though there is some discounting, we are mitigating potential risk through that process, both risk to the town and risk to the developers.
Yep. Thank you.
And just so I'm clear, if there is an adjustment and 2,000 units don't come to market, we still need to pay for the big pipe, but there's a lot of infrastructure we can adjust to, right?
Yes and no. So any future projects that we haven't delivered yet could potentially be modified, slowed down, deferred. But projects that we've actually implemented, expansions already done to the wastewater treatment plant, et cetera, that potentially could be oversized, then we would have front-ended those costs with no opportunity to collect from future units.
So that's an excellent question, and I'll just build on that a little bit, because throughout the community there have been various discussions about some of the planned units not coming to fruition, and under a variety of scenarios. So if the town were to purchase development rights from a developer that has approval, or some scenario such as that, the offsite levy calculations would be an important factor in trying to figure that out, because as Ms. DeSoto said, is that if we are not going to be collecting money for a significant enhancement at the wastewater treatment plant to enable that growth, if we're not going to see that growth, then it'll be up to the rest of the taxpayers to absorb that cost, basically.
Until that point, we have to base everything on imagination. I mean, until we know, we don't know until we know. So thinking back to 2008 or so, when East West was developing Three Sisters, and if I understand it, I wasn't on the council at the time, but if I understand it, their vision was for larger units, less units in total. So if that model had moved forward, that would have reduced perhaps significantly the number of unit counts attributed to those lands.
That's correct.
And
some projects that are in the offsite levy model that haven't started, we may be able to cancel if they were very clearly benefiting only a small area.
But if that ASP had been approved, things didn't happen as they happened. If they'd brought forward that ASP and had been approved, then all of this would have been revised to reflect far less number of units, which would have pushed up all of the offsite levy charges per unit.
Exactly. So I wouldn't want to use the term that this is based on imagination. It is more precise than that.
I mean, the imagination is what will actually happen on big blocks of land.
Right. So we have projections, and for both Silvertip, Three Sisters, and Spring Creek Mountain Village, there are approved unit numbers within their statutory approvals.
Yeah.
And so we use that as a basis, and so there would be fine adjustments, again, on an annual basis. So in the east-west example, yes, those larger units would have resulted in some reduction that we could have taken into consideration, but it still would have been within the realm, and then the fine adjustments allow us to compensate.
I think that's the end of the presentation.
That's great. I think it's an appropriate time to take a break. So unless there are any last questions for Mr. Como? Okay, we'll take a break till 10:40. Great. We're going to move on to item E1, overview of the 2017 and 2018 budgets. Ms. Van Kuympema.
So, good morning, Finance Committee members. I'm going to start with sort of where we left off during orientation, which was a little bit of information on budgeting itself, and then move into the overview. They actually lend themselves quite well to each other, so we'll take it from there. So one of the things that we wanted to talk about and to remind our incumbents who've returned, and also to provide information to both Councillors Hillstad and Mara about budgeting best practices. So this is something that we focus on and how we go about doing our budgeting. So budgeting best practices are recommendations. So they're not written in stone. They're not the 10 Commandments. They're recommendations and not requirements. So the best practices are meant to be used to enhance the quality of the decision making that comes before you, as fiscal management and responsibility is a significant portion of what Council is expected to do. So we want to make sure that we're providing you the best information and using the best process we can. So we want to make sure that when we're budgeting, we're drawing attention to the key issues and choices facing the community. I'd say probably 70 to 80% of our budget is just kind of the same thing every year. It's just a matter of what is the cost to do that. So when what we try and do is we try and focus on what's changed, and that falls into the budgeting best practices. So best practices for local government, they've been developed by the Government Finance Officers Association, both international as well as in Canada. So what are the key ingredients to best practices? Well, one of the first ingredients is that it's essential that the budget complements and supports our long-range plans. So when we had our orientation, I was talking about how we wanted to make sure that we were planning for the longer term, and budgets are to jive with that, so that we're not looking just at a single year in isolation. The budget and the budget deliberation process should highlight the key issues and the decisions that are before you to be made. The Finance Committee should include all of Council, and it should conduct its business in public. Hence that we're live streaming this meeting. So all of our Finance Committee meetings are live streamed for those public members who would like to know what's going on. Plus it also provides a record, a video record that people can go back to and look at later on. I think that's also especially important because our Finance Committee meetings tend to be during the day, where there may not be as many members of the community who have time to be able to attend the meeting in person. So the public input should be incorporated into the budget process. That doesn't mean that the public member should be sitting on the committee. It means, though, that we should be consulting the public to get input into the budgets that we're putting together and ultimately approving. So we should make sure that we consider seeking the public input earlier in the process or at the front end of the process, usually at the strategic planning and the service level decisions and discussions. As I had said during orientation, by the time we get to the budget, we're just putting numbers to the decisions that you've made earlier in the year. So another one is that non-reoccurring revenues and resources are not used to finance continuing operations. So if you have an expenditure that you're going to be making for service delivery, you shouldn't really be paying that out of your reserves. You should be paying it out of a source of revenue that's going to reoccur, just like the expense requirement's going to reoccur. One of the most important things is financial sustainability, and that shows up in our long-term financial strategy, but it also affects our operating decisions as well. So we want to make sure that we have sustainability is supported by financial policies on how we use our resources to ensure that we have a stabilized financial position, and we have that in the form of our debt management, reserves, and capital asset policies. So the capital planning process is in place. That's one of the key ingredients, and making sure that your capital planning process is linked to your strategic plan, that is linked to replacement schedules for equipment, facilities, and infrastructure, and all of this shows up in our long-term financial strategy. And it avoids commitments for projects that lack economic feasibility. That doesn't mean that it has to make money. What it means is if there's no overriding community benefit and it's a losing proposition, then you might want to consider not doing that. So long-term financial commitments towards continuing outlays are avoided unless you have a revenue source for them. So putting your blinders on and approving something and without having an idea of how you're going to pay for it going forward is not a best practice. All right, so number 10, make sure that you have a budget policy guideline and budget preparation instructions for each budget cycle. So if you recall the timeline of sort of a year in the life of the Finance Committee, one of the things we look at in late June, early July, but before summer, is to set the budget guidelines. And those are kind of the marching orders. And we'll go over those during the next part of my presentation. So identify and assess the programs and services provided. So you want to make sure that you're funding the programs that you have and the services that you provide, as well as identifying the ones that you may want to be providing or the services. And that's where you would be talking about new or changes. You want to make sure that your budget documents are really focused on your goals and your strategies. And if anyone has had an opportunity to look at the 2017, 2018 budgets, you'll see how it does tie into Council's priorities, and that's a budget best practice. So detail distracts from the big picture, leading to the tendency for decision makers, you, the Finance Committee, to focus on the small administrative items. So this is sort of where my statement at the orientation came from, where we tend to provide you budget information that's grouped by categories and changes and bigger pictures rather than minute and small details. That's a best practice, so I wasn't just pulling that out. Yes, Mayor Borman.
Just thinking back to your earlier comment about, when's the appropriate time to look for public input and that informs the budgeting process, and we talked about it being more beneficial earlier in the process rather than once we actually get to the budget. I'm trying to remember when we did that online thing last year or 2 years ago or last couple, and when did that go out? I mean, when was that available to the public?
My recollection was it was May-June time period, and yes.
So still at the time where administration was taking the direction from business planning part of the process and feeding the budget.
Yes.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, so these are the best practices. These best practices were used to develop the budget guidelines that were adopted last year. So what were they? Well, one of the major things that was different in the last budget guidelines was we went with a multi-year approved budget. So 2017 and 2018 budgets were approved at that time. Why? Well, Municipal Government Act has had some changes. And those changes, the new MGA will require municipalities to prepare 3-year operating and 5-year capital plans. Doesn't mean that they have to adopt that length of time budgets, but they are looking for making sure that the municipalities are looking longer term, as it is a budget best practice, and it is a prudent thing to do. So by starting this process early before the changes came in as law, it allowed us to sort of iron out any challenges that we might have encountered before it became mandatory. So I think we're actually a little bit ahead of the time. We can figure out what's working, what's not working, and adjust accordingly. So having approved 2018 budgets ahead of October's municipal election, I still feel, for me anyway, my opinion, that it's important for new council to come in and not have the pressure of trying to get up to speed very quickly in order to be able to approve a budget and then really not feeling comfortable to be able to approve that budget. This way it allows you, council, and the Finance Committee to spend the time that you need to come together and determine what your strategic priorities are. And then we can put some numbers to that. And that can happen in 2019. Now that doesn't mean that 2018 is written in stone and that there can be no changes. Throughout the year there can be changes. There always is every year. A capital project comes along that has to be done for whatever reason that wasn't in the budget, and council can consider that. There might be things that cost more money than we thought they were going to when we prepared any budget, even if it was a one-year budget, and it comes back to council. So at our next Finance Committee meeting on Thursday, that's where we're going to sort of dig into a little bit of what are some amendments that administration is proposing to the 2018 budgets, and it'll also give the Finance Committee members an opportunity to propose their own changes that they would like to see. And then those amendments will come to council in December for approval. Okay. It is a financial management best practice, as we just talked about, and it's less work. So I've heard from many managers, they're like, oh wow, this summer was so much better. I didn't have to spend so much time developing a budget that is 70 or 80% of just what we do every year. And then they could just focus on the budget amendments that they wanted to propose. So at the time that we prepared 2-year budgets, it wasn't double the work. And I believe the Finance Committee itself probably would appreciate not meeting for many, many meetings all of November. Just a few instead. So, budget guidelines also told us to bring in a preliminary tax increase of not more than 4.5%. The guidelines told us we should try and work within a $16.9 million annual capital funding envelope. So COLA, or cost of living increase, should be 1.3%. That's based on a June over July Calgary Consumer Price Index, or CPI index. That the operating transfer to capital should be aimed at the 5% of the previous year's taxes. We didn't achieve that. We're working our way towards that, but that was the guideline at the time. And that we should permit some format or some way to do budget amendments for 2018, as well as to consider the 2017 surplus, that council wanted to still be able to, bless you, council still wanted to be able to dictate what happened to the 2017 surplus at the end of 17 and not have to wait till the end of a 2-year period. Yes, Ms. DeSoto.
I was just wondering if you could clarify what the cost of living adjustment is applied to.
Bless you. I have that. I'm just looking to see.
Is that coming up?
Yeah, it is coming up.
Okay, then.
Yep. All right, so those are the marching orders. What do we do with the marching orders? Well, administration got busy over the summer, and then there was a series of meetings with the finance. So first of all, the managers get together and they bring that to the corporate strategic team, and the corporate strategic team thinks about all of the stuff that the managers are proposing, and we weed and slash and change and question, and then we put together something that we then bring to the Finance Committee. And then throughout November, the Finance Committee considers those budgets. So there was a series of meetings, and what we focused on was the changes. So we started as 2016 as our base year, and then we focused on what changes are happening to get to the proposed 2017 budget. And then we used 2017 as the base, and then what's being proposed as a change for 18. So we broke the categories of items that are changing into basically sort of 4 main areas. One is a status quo area. So what are the things we're just going to keep on doing, and are there changes to them? So that included revenue changes. That included third-party costs, which includes affiliates or RCMP contracts, things like that. Then we looked at what does it cost for human resources status quo. So this is where I'll explain about what I mean by the cost of living. So with our staffing, there are unionized municipalities where there's a sort of a grid system, a step system, where if you've been on the job for a year and you haven't maxed out, you get a step up on the grid, and you automatically get that step. With the town of Canmore, we don't compensate people because they've been in the job for a period of time. We compensate them based on the type of the job that they're doing, meaning how well are they doing their job. So you don't get an automatic step. It's based on a performance. So every year, administration's performance is evaluated, And if you haven't maxed out, you have an opportunity to get a performance pay adjustment that is different depending on how well your performance has been assessed. So what we do is we budget for a pool of money for performance, and that is used to pay out the increases for people based on their performance. There's also another component to our human resource cost changes, and that is the cost of living increase. So what we're finding, if we don't budget to increase the grid of the job rate and for everybody's position, then when we go out to do a comparison for fellow municipalities, we find we're quite far behind, and then in that year it costs a lot to catch up. So what we do is we take a look and see what the cost of living has been, normally June over July. That's that 1.3%. And so we budget for the money needed to move the whole thing up by 1.3%. So people would get a 1.3% cost of living, and the other component is the performance. In 2017, we did not budget for performance, so there was no money for performance. And in 2018, there is a small amount available for that. But there is cost of living in each of those years. I recently looked up what the cost of living is looking like for the purposes of the 2018 budget. Depending on the month, it ranges anywhere from like 1.2, 1.1 to 2 point something. So I feel that a 1.3 is still in line, and we don't need to make an adjustment to the 2018 budget for those purposes. So the other category we looked at was areas where we want to include a new program or a new service, or expand an existing one, change the scope. We also looked at, is there opportunities to program reductions or savings? Can we do something different, achieving the same result but for less money? Or are there programs that we've been delivering that aren't needed anymore? So that was the category of things that we were looking at when we were looking at those changes. Then another sort of group, we were looking at, there were many proposed staffing changes and program additions, but we whittled it down to what we felt was the most important and the most pressing. So those were those areas of changes. We looked at increasing our reserve contributions, because that was one of council's strategic priorities. And because we were doing a multi-year budget for 2018, we budgeted a contingency of $150,000 to take care of any budget amendments. Because we were budgeting further out, our confidence in the numbers wasn't as great as it would have been if we were just budgeting a few months ahead of when we would be spending those numbers if we were doing an annually approved budget, one at a time. That contingency in 2018 is $150,000, and we didn't collect taxes for it. We're saying if we need it, we can take that out of the operating reserve. So that might be a reoccurring expense. The operating reserve is a non-reoccurring source of income, which means it goes against best practices, but we wanted to see what it would be and what it was coming in and get a better sense. But just to be aware that if we continue with the expenditures that might need to be funded from the amendments, then that would mean an automatic tax increase in 2019, unless you wanted to draw from the reserve again and again and again until it gets to nothing.
The contingency we approved is funded from the operating reserve.
Correct. Okay, so in so most of the operating budget remains unchanged. There's just some costs, and those were all reflected in those changes. So in December of 2016, Council approved the 2017 and 18 budgets, and those included a $47.8 million operating budget for 17 and $49.8 million in 2018. That doesn't mean that's the amount of taxes we're collecting. So if you recall, we figure out how much money do we need, because we can't deficit. So we have $47.8 million in operating expenditures and $49.8. Then we take off the non-tax sources of revenue, which includes user fees, sales revenue, franchise fees, grants, things like that. We take that off, and that's how we come up with how much we need to collect in taxes. So if you're looking in your budget documents, there's a sort of a summary page, and there's a column on the left-hand side, and it shows you those numbers, the 47.8. And then if you go further down, it shows you how much of that is coming from taxes and what the change year over year is for the taxes. So we the approved 2017 capital budget is 13.1 million and 2018 is 30.5. So you may be asking yourself, we approved a $16.9 million capital funding envelope. What the heck? So we looked at 16.5 over a 5-year as an average. So 2018 is a glitch year where there were more than one large projects, and that caused to have a higher spend in 2018. So the capital includes one-time non-TCA projects, so something to explain. You may think of capital and you may think of something that's a tangible capital asset you can touch, and that should only be what's on the capital budget. If we did that and made it purely that type of budget, then when you're looking at your operating budget, and this year you have to do a master plan, or you might need to do some design work, or you might need to do something that's just a one-time thing, your operating budget's going to be bouncing all over the place. It's going to be up higher one year when you have more master plan or studies to do, down in the following year. So instead of doing that, what we've done is anything that's a one-time project, we've included into the capital budget. So that way it helps us have a more realistic picture about what a continuous operating budget looks like. So we also budgeted $100,000 each year in 2017 and 2018 for taxes from growth. So when I talked about property tax when you had the orientation, we said, you know, part of the increase in the total assessments in town comes from new assessments. We consider that that means someone new is going to help us pay for the expenditures of operating the town. And therefore, we take into consideration, rather than getting extra from the new people, we try and take that into consideration and budget for those taxes that come from growth. In 2017, the tax increase that the budget has is a 4.5 tax increase, net of the growth, net of the 100,000. In 2018, it's a 3.7 tax increase. Whoops, that wasn't supposed to happen yet. That was a surprise. So 2017 was 4.5, 2018 at this point, before any amendments, is a 3.7% tax increase before our net of the 100,000. And then the council approved the budget. That's the council that approved it. They're all gone. Now we can start fresh.
They're all gone. We're not quite dead yet.
No, but those people are, because you're not the same people anymore.
What did he say? Oh yeah, get on the curtain. Not quite dead yet.
So the information that I included in your package was sort of that, the sort of spreadsheet, I guess, that categorizes and what's changed from 16 over 17 and from 17 over 18, to give you more details of what the changes were that the Finance Committee and then the Council considered. Yes, Mayor Borman, do you have a question?
When you're finished.
Okay. So I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail telling you about it, but I do welcome questions.
So back to that previous slide showing the $100,000 in anticipated taxes from growth. That, if I recall, that was, remind me how we got to $100,000.
So, yeah, so what I do is I contact our assessor prior to coming to the Finance Committee in November to ask them what do they think the assessment changes are going to be for the following year, and to ask them to break it down between what's a change in the market price and what's a change due to growth. And then once I have the assessed value due to growth, then I use the 2016 tax rate and apply that to what the growth is to figure out how much taxes in municipal taxes we would collect from that growth. So that's how we came up with 100,000.
Right. So that would suggest something like 50 new tax-paying units.
Something like that, yeah.
And so when we're talking about 2019 or whatever, we would factor in the hundreds of units that we know are coming in, and so that tax from new growth in those years will reflect that. Yeah.
Yeah, the only danger about budgeting your growth in there is that if you have a year where you have no growth, then you've got to make up the 100,000.
Sure, but what I'm hearing is it's based on communication between yourself and the assessor and planning.
Yeah, and the planning department, yeah. Yeah, for
So
sure.
it's not a dart on the board, it's
No.
informed.
We're not using imagination.
No, we're not. Or even a crystal ball.
You're using the gift of clarity?
Yeah, that too. Yes, Ms. DeSoto.
Just to add to that conversation, there was one year I can recall several years ago where we did not receive an accurate estimate from our assessor, and we grossly underestimated growth. So we over-collected in tax revenue than what we needed to do. So we do try to be as accurate as possible, because we don't want to be in that situation either.
Yes, Councillor Sanford.
Yes, and my question's along the same lines as what Mr. Soto was just discussing. Both in 2017 and in 2018, there was $100,000 projected for growth.
Correct.
So do we have an actual for 2017 yet, or?
I have not calculated that, but I certainly can do that. Yeah.
Okay. But then in 2018, we won't know the actual until after we've set the tax rate, is that right?
Correct.
So then we're just estimating what that growth is.
Yes,
But for the two consecutive years, we're estimating $100,000.
that's correct.
Okay, so that's with your assessment through discussing it.
Yeah, so
The
that
assessor.
conversation took place in 2016. And so that the 2017 numbers we have way more confidence in. But in the absence of any other information at that point in time in 2016, we went with the 100,000 again for 18.
But we're looking at quite a bit more hotel growth and commercial growth for 2018, aren't we?
Yeah.
So we're still confident in that $100,000?
To be honest, I have not gone back to the assessor to ask what the anticipation was for 18, and that's certainly something we can look at before we finalize any budget amendments.
Yeah, that would be nice if we had a better idea, since we projected this 2 years in advance, right?
Yeah, I just am also, again, sort of cautioning, because if 17 and 18 happen to be busy years and 19 is not a busy year, then we may have to make up for that in 2020.
Mm-hmm. But we do have a tax stabilization.
Yes.
Revenue reserve, so that could be helpful there.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I just seeking clarity on that last statement, because as long as that growth materializes, we don't have to make up for it, because it will be there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's only if the growth doesn't materialize.
Correct.
So if we have a high degree of confidence, you know, construction starts, that kind of.
Yeah, you're right.
So, yeah, it's not. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Are there any other questions on the overview? Maybe if we're looking back at 2020, we will, because hindsight's perfect. Going once, going twice. All right, moving on then. So, look at that handsome gentleman. So here's Mr. Irwin, and he's on deck for presenting to you the next two topics, which are the 2017 financial report year to date, up to the end of September, as well as the capital project progress report. And without further ado, I'll turn that over to Mr. Irwin.
You must be creeping Facebook or something.
I did. You shouldn't have free access to your Facebook.
All right, good morning, Your Worship and members of the Finance Committee. Firstly, I'd like to welcome our two newest members, Karen and Jeff, to both committee and to council. We've seen lots of each other over the next year, likely. I'm here this morning to provide an update on year-to-date results as of September 30th. I'll try to be brief, as not too much has changed since I was here back in August. And overall, the year-to-date variances are mostly due to timing. This means the actual timing of invoices received and booked in accounts payable versus the estimated amounts when we wrote the budget. So there's lots of different timings whether invoices have come or not.
Many of these are projected to realign within the budget throughout the rest of the year, but there are just a few items, however, that won't, and administration has identified and would like to bring to Council's attention. ATCO and Fortis franchise fees continue to trend better than budget. This has been happening all year, primarily due to the colder winter we had last year, and there's higher base rates has been going on throughout this year. The combined increase of that is around $250,000 at the end of September. Some of you may remember, maybe not, the Fortis franchise fees go directly to reserve, so that wouldn't go to the bottom line, but about 190 of that right now is pure access money surplus. Number two, legal fees are trending higher than budget due to a number of new and ongoing items, which I don't need to get into. RCMP fine revenue is trending lower than budget, as has been the case in the past year or so as well, but it has been totally offset year to date with savings in RCMP contract costs, so they kind of net out. You have a question, John?
Do you want us to interrupt or wait until you're finished? So do you have an idea of how much trending is going on in legal?
I don't. Mr. Fark might be able to help on that one.
Yeah, it's substantial. I believe we are already at least $30,000 or $40,000 over the budgeted amount year to date. We have a number of invoices still coming in.
That's reflected in the corporate admin roll-up?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't stand out because there's some timing savings and other contracted services right now. That's
so
why
that falls in the contracted services line?
Yes.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. So with that $40,000, $50,000 trending, I mean, by the time we get to the end of the year,
we expect to possibly double the budgeted amount.
okay, thank you.
So covered RCMP. Recreation revenue is also under budget so far, only about 4%, but again, it is more than offset in savings in salaries and wages and expenses. Another big item is planning permit revenue, continues to trend better than budget. This is thanks to several large projects going on through the year and the general level of development that's going on in the community, which we've all seen. The increase so far, as of last week actually, is around $600,000, and Mr. Fish expects it to go up even more over the next couple of months. So that will be a surplus for sure.
I would just point out that very excessive amount of planning revenue has come with a corresponding amount of planning work that needed to take place.
Very much so.
So there has been a substantial workload, unanticipated workload on the department this year.
So that doesn't necessarily translate into that sort of an operating surplus. The operating surplus would reflect the additional plan fees minus or less the additional costs?
So there has been some additional costs that were funded out of council-approved budget for additional resources. So that's a separate budget line, so that will not be offsetting this additional planning revenue.
Okay.
And lastly, year-to-date payroll savings, year-to-date is around $500,000, $530,000 so far, versus the annual budget assumption of around $200,000 in payroll savings due to slippage. Administration will continue to track throughout the year. It's not in really one major area, it's generally spread out through the corporation. That's about it for major items. Your agenda package includes service area specific financial summaries with detailed variance explanations. Once you factor in all the pluses and the minuses and ups and downs, and again, it is only September, October now, administration is projecting a year-end operating surplus in the range of around $1.5 million, much of which is from non-tax sources such as the franchise fees and development revenues. There's close to $1 million just right there probably between the two at the end of the year. So town operating results at the end of September do not suggest any action from the Finance Committee, and we will continue to monitor performance as we prepare for year-end. And we'll be back to you in April with the final audited financial statements with everything's all pulled together. In conclusion, we ask that the Finance Committee accept the year-to-date financial results report for your information.
And sorry, once again, I would just point out that 1.5 million sounds like a very large number, but on a $50 million annual operating budget, it is about 3%.
And what usually happens is that comes back in the spring, once the audited statements are complete, and council is, directs where the surplus would go, usually into reserves of some kind.
Are there any questions for Mr. Irwin? Councillor McCallum?
I'm just looking at some of the notes in the roll-ups, and I was curious about recreation. I note that there was a reduction in the amount of counselors, I'm guessing camp counselors, that were recruited for the summer. Was that because of a less than anticipated registration, or unable to find those counselors? It's not a big number.
By counselors, you mean staff? Is that
Well,
what you mean by counselors?
So
camp
the
counselors.
recreation.
Yeah, it was youth,
Yeah,
it was
camp
the youth.
counselors.
The youth
Camp
counselors,
counselors. Yeah, so that would just be based on need, so.
So we didn't have as much registration as we thought. So
The
we
number of
needed
staff
some-
hired is based on registration.
Okay, perfect. I was just curious. And then the other question I had was, where did it go? FCSS, their budget is, expenditures are lower based on a reduced Meals on Wheels and Taxi Pass program. So is the reduction in Taxi Pass program requests a direct, is that because of transit? Dunno.
Yeah, I don't know. I could ask. I would be reluctant to make that link.
Okay.
We could ask if they've had that feedback directly, but I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
but I can check.
The overall is around,
It's not important, and just, it's more the curious mind.
the overall is around $4,000.
I know,
it's
it's not a
big,
lot of
but-
money, I know. I'm just
Yep.
wondering if it would offset the extra expenses with regards to the Affordable Services Program, et cetera. One shifts into the other. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Irwin? I have one, and maybe it's for Ms. Van Kampima. So when we have excess franchise fees, et cetera, does Fortis and ATCO give us predictions for next year?
Correct.
So will those be amended for the 2018 budget as part of the process moving forward?
Correct.
Okay.
We've increased those for next year, or for next
Okay.
week, or no, Thursday, we'll be discussing that. So those have been
Okay.
reflected in for change requests.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, Karen.
Oh, hi, I just have a question regarding the transit. I don't see any revenue there. Is it listed somewhere else, or is there no revenue?
It's not our revenue.
It's not our revenue,
It's
okay.
the
I just wanted to
The
explain.
commission manages it all.
Okay, thank you.
So I would expand on that. So how it works is the commission requisitions every year, the amount of money they require from us in order to run the operation. And so that requisition is net of revenue. So they look at how much revenue they're going to project, and then they make a requisition based on that and their costs. So we don't receive any revenue, they do. They just requisition costs to us.
And the revenue or the requisitions are apportioned through to the various municipal partners according to how much of this particular service is used. And it's changed this year, I know we'll hear
Right.
about that.
So for the local service, they requisition to us the full amount required. For the regional service, we split the overall administrative fees and the operating expenses for the regional, and then based on the management burden of each commission or each commission operation, there is a corresponding division again of the administration. So Banff and Canmore both have a local component. ID9 does not, and so they pay less of the administrative fees than.
Actually, this was changed.
Oh, has that been changed?
So now it's that, and it makes up less than 10% of the overall budget, but the administrative fees are now just being split 3 ways.
Can I,
I'm sorry, Mayor Borman, it's been pointed out to me that it's hard to hear you on the recording, so.
Pull your microphone close, Mike. Lean in. Be like Jack.
Apparently there's at least one person listening and you find it too hard to hear.
Councillor Sanford.
Mr. Irwin, can you just explain on, I guess it's on page 13 of the finance agenda, that last statement that said transfer to reserves increases.
So the increase is, it actually has been netted out. So the revenues that have come in that are listed there, the cash in lieu of municipal reserve and the deferred servicing agreement and the franchise fees are all included above in the lines that have come in as revenue, and we've automatically transferred them directly to reserve. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah.
So
I didn't know what CIL was, so it's cash in lieu.
Oh, cash in lieu of municipal reserve. That's
Okay.
right. And that's all in the line saying transfers in other, just above that, where the revenue came in for a cash in lieu municipal reserve receipt, $500,000. So it went in as revenue and out into the reserve.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Rick.
We just need the motion for.
Oh, sorry. The motion was that the Finance Committee accept the year-to-date the year-to-date financial report as of September 30th, 2017 for information. I'll make that motion. Any discussion? Those in favor? Motion's carried. And now item E3, capital project progress.
Okay, the next item to discuss is the capital project progress report. It's the large report you have in your packages. This report details all active capital projects that are on the go. It gives department managers the opportunity to update the committee with the status of their capital projects. It's important to note a couple of things on this report, that the spent to date numbers are only what's been actually invoiced and processed through accounts payable. They do not include any committed amounts or invoices that haven't been processed yet, that haven't been received yet. The work may be done. So those numbers don't truly reflect what's been committed. And for some of our members that have been seen this report a couple of times before, there's a new column this time around, and it's called Carry Forward to 2018, Yes or No. This column has been added to provide a preliminary indication of whether the project will be completed by the end of the year or will need to be carried forwarded into 2018. I'm going to bring up a new acronym for some of our new members here. We often refer to these carry forward projects as WIP projects, or work in progress projects. So if you hear the word WIP, that's what we mean. It's been carried over from another year. There are also a number of projects that are proposed to be canceled. As per the budget amendments policy, some will be resubmitted or evaluated as part of the 2018 capital considerations when we come back on Thursday, or will be submitted to council for direction to fully cancel the project. And we'll bring those projects in December when we bring the budget amendments. We'll do our best to answer any questions that you may have, and that's it.
Mayor Barron?
Just to that point, could you, I don't remember the discussion, so remind me, but rather than whipping or carrying forward, projects are canceled. So I'm thinking particularly of the projects on the daycare lands, the ice surface and all. So these sheets reflect that projects have been canceled with the intent to bring it back to 2018. So why are those being reflected as canceled rather than simply carried forward? Anyone?
Because per the budget amendments policy, there's been nothing spent on those projects.
Right.
So they, for the policy, they have to be canceled.
So it was in the
forward.
policy discussions, okay.
Correct.
It's kind of a
Okay, it's
technicality,
just the first time,
but
yeah.
that's why.
So this is new and it takes a little remembering.
Right.
Okay.
So Section 8 of the Budget Amendments Policy addresses capital project carry forwards. I think the intent was that, you know, if a project doesn't actually start, there's question as to, you know, how it should be evaluated against new projects coming forward. And does it automatically get preference or priority because it was approved as a project in the prior year, or should it be evaluated, you know, with its merits against all those new asks for capital funding? And so the section of that policy did specifically set out a list of criteria for how that project could be carried forward.
And now I recall some of the discussion. So now we're seeing the effect or the impact of that decision. I think it's something I'll want to sort of keep track of. Arguably, a new council could simply cancel a project that was approved and intended by the previous council.
That's correct, yep.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, the flip side is we could have a number of projects sit on our books for a number of years and never get started. And council could lose track of that as well.
Yeah, I remember the problems when we kept seeing something whipped year after year.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We've also been criticized at points in the past that, well, if you haven't started it and it's the end of the year, what causes you to think that you still need to do that project? Do we still think it's a priority? So that's the reason why we had made the changes to the carry forward policy. It used to be just if you've spent money, you can go ahead and sure, carry it forward. But there wasn't really a lot of clarity. What if you've already committed to a contract or what have you? But it was also, well, we have a bunch of these projects you haven't started, you want to carry them forward automatically. Are they still a priority for you? If they were a priority, you should have got on it. So, so this way,
Councillor McCallum, can you turn your mic on?
What happens, and I'm not in disagreement with the policy that we have. I understand why it is. It's due diligence as a backstop, but many times, not every time, but many times those projects aren't completed because we've lost staff in a certain department to be able to manage those projects.
Correct, and that was the argument that we were making, is that, you know, just because we haven't started doesn't mean it's not important.
Well, that's reflected in $500,000 of slippage.
Yeah, so staffing is certainly a constraint. It is not the only one. There are seasonal constraints. There are constraints related to factors that we don't control. The Old Daycare Lands project, for example, it took longer for the developer and CCHC to get through their process required than was anticipated. So that project started later in the year, and so our ability to start the rink project was consequently delayed. But I agree that staffing is often a major contributing factor.
That being said, so on the Old Daycare Lands project, the current rink is going to be maintained through the winter, correct?
Correct.
That is correct.
And the money to do that is actually coming out of 2015 capital budget project, I believe, to do that operationally.
So no, the maintenance of the rink is part of, and the fact that the rink will continue to operate remains part of our operating project.
But I understand that there's actually some water delivery or something that needs to happen to be able to flood the rink, and those funds are not embedded within our operating?
I think you're referring to an installation of a hydrant and a water line. So we need to get water to the rink currently, and it's there's a water hydrant that we attach a fire hose to in order to flood the rink to build the ice. And so when the rink moves, that water line will have to be extended and a hydrant replaced in order to continue to service.
For the new rink.
Right. And
I thought that there was some sort of infrastructure that was required as a temporary stopgap to make that rink happen over this winter.
Part of that infrastructure project, though, is associated to the housing development on the daycare lands, because they also need water servicing.
Gotcha.
So the water servicing for the rink was going to be done at the same time as the water line servicing for the housing development.
Okay, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So I don't know if this is possible or if it's even desirable, but instead of having cancel, which might put a bit of panic into some of our constituents, could we find another term that was like not deferred necessarily, but to be resubmitted to 2018 something? Because cancel means you're done, it's over. So could we, is there a chance that we could revisit that policy and make a definition or make a distinction between canceled and deferred, resubmitting, whatever?
Yeah, I don't think the change needs to be in the policy, because the policy is pretty clear about that, it could come, like it has to be canceled in that year and it comes forward for consideration. I think we can change the terminology in the report itself to something different. Yeah, and to provide better explanation. One of the other points I wanted to make was that I really appreciate the new policy in that it really does lend accountability and transparency to what we're doing. So council gets to know exactly what's happening on each of the projects, and then you get to make a decision on what's going to happen going forward. It's not that that wasn't happening before, but I think this is now reflected in a beefed up financial policy.
So in contrast to that, just looking at 701, the procurement budget.
Page
1701.
Oh, sorry, 1701, yeah. So the very first one, there hasn't been any budget expended on that project, but the RFP has been awarded. So we're expecting an invoice on that project before the end of 2017. Is that correct?
The policy allows if an RFP has been issued, if a contract has been signed, or if an invoice is expected. So the policy is quite clear that that means a project started.
Okay, so that's the definition
That's
of start.
yeah,
correct.
You've already done the RFP.
Yeah.
So that project is in progress, and it will be whipped into next year.
Correct.
Now, in contrast to that, then 1606, the electronic invoice distribution, says cancel.
What section are you in?
Just below that, page 30?
2/3 of the way down.
Page 30,
that
under,
first page?
1606, under IT, information technology. So that one says cancel, and there has been budget expended on that to date. But that means we're not bringing that forward to next year?
Correct. So what would happen if it says council? That would have to, only council can actually cancel something in a budget. So that would come in December. When we bring budget amendments, we'd also be giving you a report on the projects that we're recommending for cancellation, and then council makes that final decision.
All right. And then I guess my third question is, if say 1703, the public art project, which says the budget expended to date is 8,160, and the project is complete, and we're not whipping it forward, so that means that the remaining part of that budget is going to go into the surplus?
Well, because it's a capital project, it just means, like, we'll take less of the funding source that was going to be used for that.
That's coming from the public art
Correct.
reserve anyway, right? So
Yes.
it just isn't taken out of the reserve, so it's not really our surplus, it's...
Correct. The project came in under budget, which means we took less money out of the art reserve because we had to pay for less.
Okay, yeah, because that's a new column for us now to digest,
Yeah.
so thank you for explaining it.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, any capital project that's under budget, that does not contribute to the surplus at all.
Okay.
Right.
Right, so that's the distinction.
Yeah.
Thank you for explaining.
Just want to talk a little bit about following projects through multi-years. And particularly, I noted this when looking at project under protective services, the bottom of the front page, 1311 and 1411, but it also applies to the next page under facilities project 1717. So on these sheets, looking at project 1311, for instance, from 2013, the capital project budget sheet actually reflects a $50,000 budget, but now in this format, it's showing $305,000. And if I recall, the $50,000 was part of a longer multi-year project, but to follow the ball, to follow the information, if we're going to, like councils in subsequent years looking at this, if you want to go back and see what informed that budget, and it doesn't connect, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. That should be the exception rather than the rule. They should connect. The approved capital justification sheet from the 2013 budget. So if my recollection serves me correct, we got extra funding from the province. We came back to council, sought approval to increase the budget for that project. But if that would not sort of direct us to go back and change the justification sheet that was originally approved.
And I have that all, obviously, all detailed upstairs.
So for us to be able to follow that line, we would have to go to you and say what happened.
Right.
Which is
and
quite easy to do.
The same thing happened on 1717, the washer dryer replacement, which on this sheet is reflected at 32, but in the 2017 it was at $15,000 budget. So that came back and was approved to go to 32.
So in that particular case, it was not a decision that came back to council. It was a transfer from another capital project. That, according to, again, the budget amendment policy, the CAO has the authority to transfer between capital projects with under certain conditions. So in this particular case, sure, when we actually went out to tender, the cost to do the work, so the scope remained the same, and we had another capital project budget that was under budget, and we were able to transfer funds from one to the other.
So maybe what we could try to do is reflect that in these sheets, because I'm looking at 32,000 thinking, how did that get from 15 to 32?
Yes, we will, because as the budget amendments policy is fairly new, well, it was recently updated, so it behooves us to look at updating this sheet because we can now more accurately reflect what's been done through that policy.
Yeah, great, just so I can, understand where it went or how it went there. And I think I've asked this before, but the Project 1560 under facilities, the fire hall insurance claim, we never did have a project capital budget sheet that came along afterwards, but it was assigned a number. Is there any way for anybody ever to find the detail on 1560?
We actually had a $225,000, I believe, budget for that.
But it wasn't approved
over the insurance claim.
But it wasn't approved as part of the 2015 budget, because it...
So we didn't anticipate the fire. We didn't talk to somebody,
No.
ask them to start it on fire. Therefore, we didn't include it in the budget. So just like Ms. DeSoto was explaining why sort of trying to follow the bouncing ball, the budget documents that you get is that snapshot in time, what's been approved at that time, and then things happen afterwards. So the fire was one of those things that happened afterwards. And normally, if it was something that we were just going to pay for out of insurance, we, as in the finance department, have to have a way to account for that. So therefore, it's given a capital project number because it's a one-time thing. So that's how it came to get 1560. Now, if we had just put back what we had and we were just spending insurance documents, insurance proceeds, council wouldn't have had a report. But we needed to get council's approval to spend beyond what we were going to get back from insurance because we were going to make improvements, and hence Mr. Irwin's comment about we had come back to council and got $225,000 budget approved to do the over and above component. So the reason why it has a capital project but not a capital project justification sheet is that for accounting purposes we have to track capital, and everything we track needs a number.
So that's just an accounting thing in that case. Thanks.
And it came after the budget process, right? It wasn't part of the budget process. That's why you wouldn't find that in your budget binder.
I'm just thinking out loud here. One way we could show that is, as you've noted, some of the projects have the year after them, right? So we could, instead of saying 2015, we could say 2015 supplemental or something, so that it's clear that it wasn't part of the approved budget, it came as an approval afterwards. So you would have to go then to your council resolution list and see that you've made that.
Start to get complicated to try
to track it. Yeah, but you know, as these are the exception, you've pulled out the exceptions, which is good. Means you're tracking them.
Shows
and
that we actually look at this
shows
stuff.
that you actually look at it, and you know, we can always ask, and we'll get you a copy of that resolution that approved that project, or the history for that.
Just to make matters worse, or better, for 2018, the numbering system is going to change with our new records management system. If you can tell on here, like 1701 is a 2017 project, and 15 is a 15 project. Well, it was a 2007 project, so we're duplicating numbers. As it goes, it only runs for 10 years. So with the new our new system, they're going to be sequential. So we're going to be starting at 7,000 and moving up. So I'll add another column with brackets what year the project is
Perfect.
going forward. So that'll will change
But
starting in 18.
what I'm also hearing is that under the project progress column, we could add a note for the exceptions that would provide some of the context around the exception. So in the case, for example, with the fire department, the washer dryer, we can add a note, budget transfer.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. I have one or two other less detailed questions. Just curious on the project 1735 under engineering, the bus stop improvements, and there's meant to be 4 shelters built, and it says it'll be completed by fall, so are the shelters coming shortly?
Yes, indeed they are. So we are expecting all of the remaining bus stop improvements to arrive by about the end of this month. And installation end of this month, first week or 2 of December. So as you rightfully pointed out, technically the fall runs until December 21st.
Yeah, we're still in fall.
We technically have until December 21st to complete that work.
Perfect.
And we expect it to be completed by then.
Great. And can you just remind me where those shelters are going, which stops?
Off the top of my head, I believe that they are, yeah.
He's just gazing off
Yeah.
into the distance.
Corner of Benchlands and Railway. I believe also in front of the Shoppers Drug Mart. And there was one at Palliser. Yeah.
Okay.
That's my rough estimation,
Curious.
rough recall.
Great. And this is a question related to other conversations, but project 1656 on almost at the end of the report, the Spring Creek Drive rehabilitation. So work is progressing towards substantial completion in October, and that still applies to our part of the project.
That is correct, although it actually applies for the entire project.
Okay.
So we tendered it and we managed it as one complete project.
So the whole project will be complete, substantially complete last month.
So it was a number of weeks ago that this sheet was filled in. The
Yeah.
substantial completion was more or less complete by the end of October. There is some ongoing work, and the road is currently open to emergency vehicle and local access only, and that will remain in place for a few more weeks.
And am I right then in assuming that the whole roadway will be open so somebody could drive all the way through from Main Street out to the roundabout at that time?
Yeah, so currently, it is for emergency access and local access only, but yes, you can make your way entirely through the street from either end.
Okay.
We do have a request from Spring Creek Mountain Village to maintain it as emergency and local access only until about mid-December, as they have substantial work on their hotel that would require road and traffic management. So we are in discussions with them about finalizing that.
Okay. And one last minor question on project 1536 and wayfinding back from 2015 under engineering. Just talks about wayfinding for washrooms in the town center to be completed as a pilot project. You know what that's looking like?
No.
Okay.
I don't know what it looks like.
I know what it sounds like, but
Right. So there will be, as in I don't know what the signs are going to look like. There will be some directional signage. So it's one of the primary areas of concern we hear routinely from the BRZ,
Sure.
that businesses in the downtown are constantly requested for either access to private washrooms or directions to the public.
Right.
So as part of the wayfinding, we are adding some additional signage in the downtown.
Perfect. And are we expecting the signage to direct people both to that public washroom and this one?
Yes,
Or just
although
that
primarily to this one, because the public washrooms in the Civic Center are not available for the same periods of time that this washroom here is.
These washrooms are available 7 days a week, correct?
No.
Yes, they are.
Well, if the museum's open.
Yeah, they're on the weekends, they are available when the museum is open.
Okay. think that's all my questions. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I noticed that there's a, on page 30, under 1659, there's the purchase of the Grotto Road, the 2 properties there. And I'm wondering, I was looking for 990 Wilson Way, but is that from? So that was wrapped up in 2016. So this one carried over into 2017, wrapped up then?
That's
Okay.
correct, yes.
So that's why we're not seeing it on the sheet.
That's right. 990 Wilson Way is already bought and paid for, and that project was closed.
In 2016?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any further questions on the capital project updates? Okay, seeing none, I'll make the motion that the Finance Committee accept the year-to-date capital project progress report as at September 30th, 2017 for information. Those in any discussion? Those in support? Motion's carried. And I think that was it. Catherine, I'm just wondering, were there any instructions or anything for Thursday's meeting that we needed to pass on? No? Okay. Then I'll move motion to adjourn the Finance Committee. Those in favor? Motion's carried. Meeting's adjourned.
And I have my annual Canmore Lions Club Grey Cup full tickets. Happen to be with me.